Many people still view what's happening in the Persian Gulf as just another distant conflict that affects anyone but themselves. It seems like it's just another story about oil, tankers, missiles, stock market quotes, and loud political statements. But in reality, right now in this region, a problem is forming that's far more dangerous than just a spike in gas prices. People will feel its consequences not on their TV screens but in local stores, at markets, and in their own wallets. Because it's not just energy resources that pass through this narrow stretch of water. Along with oil and gas, the things essential for growing new crops are getting stuck there too. We're talking about fertilizers, the very substances that determine how much grain, corn, and other crops can be harvested by the end of this year. If supplies are disrupted right now, in the spring, the damage could be far more severe than most people realize. We've seen this scenario before, when oil, logistics, and fuel prices skyrocketed amidst military upheavals. Usually everything else follows suit down the chain: transport, production, storage, and eventually food prices. But the current situation differs in one very important detail. This time, the risk isn't just that food will be more expensive to deliver. The risk is that there might be less of it produced right from the growing stage. Farmers all around the world are entering the most sensitive period of the season. Right now is when the foundation for the future harvest is being laid. This is especially true for crops that are extremely dependent on nitrogen fertilizers. Take corn, for example. For the agricultural sector, especially in the United States, it's one of the key crops. It's used for feed processing and in a massive chain of food and industrial production. But corn doesn't grow on enthusiasm alone. It needs nitrogen, and not just any time, but specifically at the start of the spring cycle. And this is where the most dangerous part of this whole story begins. If a farmer doesn't get the required amount of fertilizer on time, they can't just catch up with the season later. Nature doesn't have a pause button. There's a short window when a critical portion of nutrients must be applied to the soil. If this moment is missed, no amount of money, logistics, or promises can compensate. The potential yield will already be lost. Some might say, well, if corn is difficult, why not just switch to other crops like soybeans or wheat? On paper, it sounds reasonable. But in reality, the farmer falls into a trap because these crops are already under pressure from oversupply. Their prices don't provide the margin needed to cover the costs and risks involved. So it's a dead end: either overpay for scarce fertilizers for corn or switch to crops that don't promise a decent profit. Essentially, farmers find themselves caught between two bad options. The Persian Gulf countries play a key role in the global export of urea and ammonia. This is not some secondary market segment, but the foundation of modern agriculture. When a war, blockade, or supply disruption starts in such a region, the world faces not just local turbulence, but a blow to the entire food system. And this impact is already visible in the numbers. Fertilizer prices are rising rapidly, and the growth is happening at the exact moment when the agricultural season cannot wait. It is particularly concerning that the problem is not limited to Iran. One of the most critical hubs is Qatar. This state is usually associated with gas, but its role in fertilizer production for the global economy is also colossal. A giant industrial center is located there, involved in gas processing and urea production. And if such a facility stops, it's no longer just a failure at one plant, it's a blow to the global chain on which harvests on different continents depend. The most unpleasant part is that some farmers have already paid for their supplies. That is, the money is gone, the season is underway, but the goods are not arriving. Ships are idle, routes are paralyzed, insurance for many destinations is cancelled or has spiked in price, and legally, force majeure makes the situation almost hopeless. If a producer officially declares they cannot fulfill a contract due to war, the buyer is effectively left alone with their problem. No goods, no compensation, and no time to find an equivalent replacement. That is why the situation is turning into a race against time. Not in an abstract sense, but literally day by day. Every week of downtime during this spring period increases the likelihood that part of the global harvest will be worse than expected. And this already triggers the next cascade. Smaller harvests mean higher prices for grain, feed, meat, dairy products, and practically the entire food basket. Moreover, the effect will be spread out over time. People don't always notice such crises immediately. At first, the problem seems far away, then fuel prices rise slightly, then transport costs increase, and then suddenly it turns out that ordinary products cost completely different money. And the most surprising thing is that all this is unfolding against the backdrop of other processes that already look alarming on their own. In different countries, approaches to land, ownership and control over the agricultural sector are beginning to change. Europe is buying up land, farmers are facing increasing pressure, and the global food system is becoming less and less stable. In other words, the world is entering a period where several pillars are being hit simultaneously: energy, logistics, raw materials, and agriculture. The most dangerous thing about such crises isn't even the first blow itself, but how quickly it starts to spread through the entire system. Because the food market isn't something separate from the economy, energy, or politics. It's the world's nervous system. And when a failure occurs within it, the consequences are almost never limited to a single industry. First, basic resources become more expensive, then producers start cutting back on purchases, then expected yields drop, after which a struggle for the remaining supply begins. And at that moment, it's no longer the farmer, the trader, or the buyer who takes the stage, but the state. And that's when a market crisis turns into a political one. Why is this so important? Because rising food prices are one of the most explosive factors in any country. People can tolerate expensive electronics for a long time, postpone buying a car, or put up with a falling stock market. But when the price of bread, meat, milk, vegetables, and grains goes up, absolutely everyone feels it. And especially those who don't have a financial cushion. In such a situation, inflation stops being a dry economic term and turns into everyday aggression. People start getting nervous, angry, blaming the authorities, external enemies, and businesses. And when irritation is layered onto an already unstable international situation, it becomes the perfect breeding ground for a new wave of chaos. And here another layer of the problem emerges, which is being talked about much less now than it should be. The point is that modern agriculture has become too dependent on global synchronization. In the past, crises could be local: a crop failure in one country, a drought in one region, disruptions in one port. Today, everything is structured differently. One region produces fertilizers, another grows the crop, a third processes it, a fourth ensures the transport, a fifth finances the deals, and a sixth acts as the main consumer. This is an incredibly efficient model in peaceful times. But as soon as a serious failure occurs in one place, this entire perfect machine starts working against itself. After all, what's happening now? Even if the active phase of the conflict suddenly eases tomorrow, the system won't automatically rewind. Lost days won't return, disrupted deliveries won't arrive retroactively, factories won't be able to instantly ramp up volumes, and farmers won't get a second chance to start the season. In other words, the damage begins to take on a life of its own, even after the television coverage becomes less dramatic. That's why markets react so nervously not only to the strikes themselves, but also to any signals of logistical disruption. They understand the problem isn't just one day of war, but the long trail of consequences. Moreover, if fertilizer shortages and declining yields coincide with weather anomalies in even a few major agricultural regions, the situation could escalate to a completely different level. Because poor logistics is only half the battle. Expensive fertilizers are also a tough but still manageable scenario. But if heat, drought, floods, or unstable rainfall are added to this, the world will face not just one cause for a food shock, but several at once. These are the kinds of crises that usually hit the hardest because they overlap with one another. Against this backdrop, it's especially interesting to watch the behavior of major players, because wealthy nations and large corporations almost never wait for problems to fully manifest. They start taking precautions in advance. Some buy up raw materials ahead of time, some sign long-term contracts at any price, some build up reserves, while others tighten control over logistics hubs, ports, storage facilities, land, and agricultural production. And in the end, we get a very harsh reality. Those with the money and access secure their stability in advance, while everyone else is left with the residual market at a much higher price. This raises a question that many still find too bleak. Is the world entering an era where the struggle will be not just for oil, gas, and rare earth metals, but for food as a strategic resource? Not long ago, this would have sounded like an exaggeration. But today, food is becoming more than just a commodity. It's gradually turning into an instrument of power. A country that controls the export of grain, fertilizers, fresh water, seeds, agricultural chemicals, and transport routes gains influence no less than that of an oil field owner. And this opens up a very unpleasant prospect. When a resource becomes strategic, it begins to be used not only economically but also politically. Export restrictions, quotas, priority supplies to allies, secret agreements, and pressure on dependent markets begin to emerge. In other words, the world is moving toward a model where globalization exists only in name, while in practice, every country tries to save itself first. While this used to apply mainly to energy and technology, this principle is now shifting into the food sector as well. For the average person, this won't look like a grand geopolitical game, but rather a strange feeling that life is getting harder for no single obvious reason. Today, egg prices go up. Tomorrow, it's meat. Then grains suddenly get more expensive. Next, shipping rates rise. Then stores start changing their stock. And after a while, it turns out that familiar products are either too expensive or have dropped in quality. This is exactly how a real systemic crisis works. It rarely comes as a single loud blow. More often, it arrives as a slow strangulation of the status quo. Another point that many underestimate is that the food crisis affects not only the wallet but the entire financial system. Because rising food prices fuel inflation, and inflation prevents central banks from lowering interest rates quickly. High rates put pressure on businesses, loans, consumption, and the housing market. And it results in a chain reaction. War in one region affects the supply of fertilizers. This hits the harvest. The harvest affects inflation, inflation affects regulatory decisions, and regulatory decisions affect all global capital. So thinking that this is just a problem for farmers or Middle Eastern countries is a huge mistake. And the more this architecture is tied to a few critical points, the more vulnerable it becomes. We lived too long with the feeling that the market would always find a replacement, logistics would always adapt, and shortages would always be temporary. But now we see a different reality. There are things that simply cannot be replaced quickly. You can't build a new fertilizer plant in a couple of weeks, you can't instantly redirect the entire global flow of raw materials, you can't replay the agricultural cycle in the middle of the season. That's why the main problem isn't whether an instant apocalypse will happen. The main problem is that the world is gradually losing its margin of safety. It's becoming a system where any new crack goes deeper and deeper. Crises used to be isolated, but now they are interconnected. Military conflict exacerbates logistical failure. Logistical failure fuels inflation, inflation fuels social tension fuels political instability, and political instability in turn prevents rational decisions from being made in time. So the question is no longer whether this crisis will affect everyone else. The question is how deep it will penetrate into daily life before most realize that they are facing not a temporary price spike, but the beginning of a much more serious turning point.